Hello, my name is Andy Schmuckler. I've been working on the forces that have been contending for American destiny uh, pretty full time for about 30 years. And uh, the catastrophe we have reached at this point, uh, as hard as it is to take, I also see it as a teachable moment, a learning opportunity. Uh, Back in the period before, say, all the way up to through the first Bush presidency, the Republican Party was a normal American party. Um, the the party of Eisenhower, the party of Stevenson in the 50s, they were comparable mixtures uh, of decency and defects. So that's pretty much where we were. Yet there began, as W's presidency, at least this is how I perceived it. Uh, there emerged in more and more in control of the Republican Party a different kind of person or people with a different kind of spirit. Um, there, it was kind of a rogues gallery in which uh, someone like Newt Gingrich would be, who's basically a sociopath, would be the face and um, defining force, and then in the media there'd be a Rush Limbaugh, and it was a process of contention. And in '96, Bob Dole was still the old Republican Party, as grouchy as a guy as he was. He was still basically a decent Kansas man. But the Republican Party was becoming something very different. So what would have been unthinkable back in the world in which Eisenhower was president in the 50s and Reagan was president in the 80s, the idea of uh, the American people making a choice for something that was so blatantly what previous generations of Americans, Republicans and Democrats, would have rejected and repudiated. There had been uh, a, a real transformation in the state of consciousness, the way Republicans thought and felt. If you would say that the Republicans of an earlier era that I came into full adulthood in the wake of World War II, where the conservative Americans were basically as decent as the liberal Americans, and there was a normal political process. But now we reached the point where more and more it was politics as war. It was more and more use of the lie. It was showing no particular concern for how to advance the nation, serve the common good, and all that stuff. Always being involved in a struggle for power, at which they're very good. But at the same time, to understand how we got to this catastrophic moment, it is important to know that it wasn't just what happened on the right. We have reached a point of considerable danger and brokenness because both sides of America's polarizing society were showing significant defects. The defects on the right, that's what we've been looking at, and the coming of fascism, possibly with this election, with the American people actually choosing it, where they would have repudiated it, according to my assertion. It would be very few people who would get the votes of something that was as manifestly all the things that this Trump Republican Party is now. Yet, even though it should have been completely visible to everybody, and whether they were seeing it or not, whether they understood what they were voting for or not, it was right out there that Donald Trump represented a very, very dangerous and destructive force, which is the opposite. He was trailing like a whole collection of any one of which would have been automatic disqualifiers in an earlier America. I mean, who before that in conservative America could have ever survived the Access Hollywood tapes, let alone survive openly fomenting an insurrection, openly developing a campaign because you know you're going to lose in 2020, to become the first American presidential loser to refuse to concede defeat, which is at the heart of our whole constitutional order. A whole lawlessness somehow taking over the party that had previously had really sincere commitments to things like law and order. Part of that was racist, but part of it also was a belief in a certain kind of structure. The same people who hold traditions sacred also hold it sacred that the rule of law. They talk about it, the conservatives, on the town square on the 4th of July and making patriotic speeches. But this Republican Party, it became the opposite in so many ways of what it had been. Being taken over by something that you can infer from a certain coherence of the whole thing that increasingly this Republican Party's role in the unfolding of events in a whole variety of directions is almost invariably a negative impact. Like what they say and what they do, it moves the ball in the wrong direction on each thing, whether it's climate change or the rule of law or relationships between the races. There gets to be this incredible consistency that whenever there's sort of the more whole thing and the more broken thing up for grabs, the consistency of this particular political party in our times, leading to their becoming the party of fascism, it's continually that they're pushing in the direction of more brokenness. And you can look at the record of the Republican Party over the last 30 years, and you can make a very long list of things that they did that were unprecedented. So there was something taking over the Republican Party that was not the same spirit as used to rule that party. The name was the same, but the spirit, the moral and spiritual dimension of things, Dwight Eisenhower's Republican Party, even between Bush the father and Bush the son, there is a fundamental darkening of the party that takes place, and one can speculate about why would the son of George Bush the first be in the grip of a kind of consistent brokenness, which is reflected in the fact that when he left office, he left almost everything in a state of terrible disrepair. So much damage had been done at so many levels. But the thing is, this huge transformation that was taking place, both in the Republican Party and in the tens of millions of Americans who constituted their source of electoral power, that significant transformation is not even noticed, hardly at all, in the liberal world. And so the catastrophe we're in now is not just because the right has turned into this thing which is great about struggling for power and getting more and more power, but it's completely unprincipled and has nothing, has no impulse to do anything good, and which in fact seems somehow always to find some way of making things worse. It's a thing that you see there with all that consistency. You can infer it from the fact that whether it's climate change or the rule of law or whatever, they're on the wrong side. So what we're seeing here is something that was rising on the right. And what the left's liberal America's role in this catastrophe is, it was their job to defeat this thing in the cradle. It was their job to understand, observe, and recognize the significance of what was happening over there, and to beat it back, to fight against it. And I have a lot of personal experience because I started trying in the 1990s to deal with the liberal world, to find a way of fighting against the poisoning that Rush Limbaugh was doing to the minds of tens of millions of ditto heads. You want to know how do you get from an America which was as sane as, say, Reagan's America, not to mention Carter's America. How do you get to that? Well, you don't get to it with something like Donald Trump. And you don't get to it with the help of somebody like Rush Limbaugh, playing on people's resentments and passions and basically painting a dishonest picture. All this was happening, and liberal America did not see that the Republican Party had actually, over the course of, I would say, the 90s, culminating when George W. Bush maybe won the 2000 nomination over John McCain. John McCain being somebody who would not have a sociopath as like Karl Rove serving as his brain, because there was more decency in the fellow, but the Republican Party had already taken a significant turn away from the direction of decency. It has been since 1976 that an incoming Democratic president has been treated by the Republican Party as having legitimacy, as, okay, this is the guy that people hired to be president, which has been the American way. But when the Republican Party changed, the Democratic Party did not recognize that suddenly the game had been really quite different. I mean, you don't generally have a Republican Party or a political party that is so determined to destroy, I'm talking about Bill Clinton's presidency here, to destroy the presidency of the other side, because a fundamental unwillingness to accept that we're sort of in this together and we play by the rules. So they were trying to find some basis from way back, trying to find some way of destroying Clinton's presidency rather than working with it. And then, of course, when Obama was elected president, same thing. People thought it was because he was black. And maybe it was used a lot because he was black, but they did the same thing to Clinton by going after him for everything he ever did with any kind of woman. But that they're whitewater, and then if whitewater doesn't work, let's keep looking. That's not how impeachment's supposed to go. But when a political party has committed itself to politics just as war, just as a way of trying to get power, and going after a president rather than respecting the fact that he was chosen by the will of the people. Already with Clinton, the Republican Party had turned into something that was contrary to the basic spirit of American politics, where we fight over issues and we respect the Constitution, which gives the legitimacy to people who win free and fair elections. But they did it to Clinton because of Clinton's being morally sleazy, but they would have found whatever they could have found by that point. They were all into power already. And then after Clinton, there's Obama. and the birther lie, delegitimizing the president with the racist uh, pitch to this guy's got African in him. And he's illegitimate because of his race, and he's illegitimate because of the lie about his being born in Kenya. Mind blowing though that is, since there was a notice of his birth in 1961. I mean, who knew so far in advance that this guy would have to pretend to be American born? I mean, it was ridiculous, but Trump rode that into the political arena. And still, the Democrats didn't really recognize what was going on. They didn't say, hey, something really dark and destructive has taken over this thing. The Republican Party has become, and here is my money phrase, a coherent force that consistently works to make the world more broken, to make the human world worse. There was that thing to see. I wrote a piece. You can Google my last name, Schmuckler, and the concept of evil. The subtitle of it is Why It Is Intellectually Valid and Politically and Spiritually Important. But the liberal world's worldview, this is my interpretation, and I feel fairly confident about it. The liberal worldview didn't accommodate the thing that was manifested in all these forms of brokenness that were unfolding over the years, one after another, across the board obstructionism under Obama. I mean, that's an indefensible policy. And the Democrats never got up and denounced it. It's been the right going altogether into the dark and waging continual war, because there's never such a thing as enough power if you're in that dark place. So there will never be enough power. It will be a continuous war. And then there's the Democratic side, which doesn't recognize what's arisen over there. You've got Democrats, even well into the age of Trump, continually here and there. I mean, not continually, but talking about our friends across the aisle. I mean, this was a political party that was acting like their enemies for years. Wasn't respecting the outcome of elections unless they won them. And the Democrats didn't recognize this as something new. It was something new. And so why, if there was something so fundamental being changed, like a Reagan conservative America never would have chosen this guy, I'm maintaining, if you accept that. And then now, 40 years later, this conservative America votes for him, many of them with fervency. What's happened? And why didn't the liberal America ever recognize it and fight it? Because it's the weakness of liberal America that is its role in this. And I have been fairly emphatic in saying it's a mistake to think that there is something weak about the campaign that Kamala Harris ran. In fact, given the circumstances, I think she did an extraordinary job in making her campaign significant and positive and dramatizing the choice the American people took. But even though Trump had manifested all the reasons why he's the last person you could probably even invent, except you might make him more competent in some ways. But if you wanted a president who could be maximally destructive of the society and of all the values that we hold dear, Donald Trump is an extraordinarily good choice to be a wrecking ball on American society, on American culture, on American vibes, and on American law and justice and role in the world. how did you get from the, the conservative America of Reagan's era or of Eisenhower's era? How did you get to a conservative America that would respond to what Trump was quite openly offering? Lies, hate, conflict, division, rage, revenge, punishing the vulnerable. What a what a wonderful assortment of things to be attracted to. There is so much brokenness that's required to be attracted to that. Or alternatively, if you don't see that Trump is a criminal, a liar, a bully, a cheat, if you don't see that in spite of all the evidence, then there has got to be something really kind of broken in the process by which you are taking in information and forming an understanding about the world. One way or another, people who are, this is something I've wrestled with for some years now, that I'm living in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, which is 2-1 or 70% Trump area. I have known a lot of intelligent people who believe things that are obviously not true. And I've marveled at that. So one of the transformations of this thing has been to disable a lot of people from seeing a lot of obvious truths, however they did that. But in any event, this big transformation occurred. Liberal America was not discussing it. And I know this because in the 90s, in the talk radio world, and in the W period, in the world of blogging, I could tell that liberal America was not seeing how the level of our political battle had dropped to the most fundamental level, which was best understood as as a battle between good and evil, with evil defined as a coherent force that consistently works to make things worse. Now, I claim in my Better Human Story to be able to prove that there is such a thing as a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world more broken, that it can be discerned, and actually can be discerned in a couple of ways. But in any event, being able to discern it is precisely what was missing in liberal America as this thing arose. In the early period of Newt Gingrich's rise, I used to write about how regrettable it was that Bill Clinton didn't have the moral authority, some way, to call upon America to recognize something about what was going on in the Republican Party of Newt Gingrich, where propaganda techniques were being used on the people in accordance with the teachings of what is his name, Goebbels, the Nazi propagandist that Gingrich studied, manipulating people into demonizing the other side, for example. The idea that a lie told often enough again begins to be seen by people as the truth. Something dark was going on there, and liberal America did not see it for what it was. Did not think it was its job to fight for the hearts and minds of a Republican base that was listening to a sociopath like Newt Gingrich and listening to another sociopath whipping up rage and resentment and prejudice on the right with hundreds of, tens of millions of ditto heads, Rush Limbaugh. Not the spirit of Reagan with its kind of radiant qualities, and not the first Bush with its pretty deep-seated decency, the kind of guy who writes these wonderful thank you notes. But a different kind of party, a party of a guy who will get on the floor of the House and denounce Bill Clinton for his dalliance with a woman not his wife, when we later find out that Newt Gingrich was actually guilty of similar offenses, but at a much more profound level of gravity by most accounts. That's the kind of party it was becoming. It wasn't until the coming of Trump, and even then, not really right away, that liberal America began to recognize that there was something on the right that was a coherent force that consistently worked to make the human world more broken. It didn't begin with Trump. I mean, we know that because by 2015, we have a Republican base that, by a legitimate primary process, chooses Donald Trump to be their nominee for president. Even though already by 2015, it was obvious that he was pretty much the kind of guy that our founders would have told you, don't give him the powers of the presidency. So selfish, using, insulting, lack of respect, unwillingness to subordinate his own personal interests. I mean, he has every vice. But already the Republican base was in a frame of mind which, whatever that frame of mind was, between not seeing or not minding, was willing to choose such a person to be their nominee for president. I've been consistently wrong about the conservatives of America through this crisis. I have continually way overestimated how readily any part of conservative America can be reached and brought back to the better angels of their nature. I misjudged again and again. And I don't know whether I'm misjudging similarly now in the thought that a lot of people who voted for this dangerous plunge, possibly into fascism, depending on how it plays out, how many of them are going to recognize the ugliness and disruptiveness of what they've put into power. I pretty much count on it being ugly, and what will the American people experience with that? Well, how many of the people who voted for Trump will suddenly recognize, oh my gosh, look what we elected? Or how many of them will not even notice that a vibrant, free society like the United States, where power reasonably came from the bottom up, had been turned substantially into some kind of a fascistic dictatorship to one degree or another. Whether I was struck by a line in a piece by Paul Krugman recently, where he's talking about the danger of fascism coming to America with a Trump victory, and he talks about, maybe you're thinking it would be like in Hungary with Orban. And then which I think is a pretty ugly thing all by itself, but not as ugly as Russia, I guess. And I, he says we should be so lucky. In other words, we should be so lucky that the fascism a la Trump is as soft and not brutal as Orban's in Hungary. Well, I'm sorry. Yeah, yeah, but there are levels of depravity and cruelty and viciousness, and but we really can't give up the fight against this thing. And I think part of what is required to fight the fight is to understand what we're up against. Go to Amazon um, and look up my name, and you'll see that book from 2015. What we're up against. It makes a case for how we should recognize what came to control the Republican Party and the dynamic that has been playing out in which evil has become very powerful because good failed to recognize what it was up against. That was the defect in the world order. There is such a thing as a coherent force that that arose and took over the Republican Party. That's what is implied by it's consistently making things more broken. Every time it chooses the worst side, that consistency is evidence of something behind it. And see the it, fight the it. And that coherent force, that, that is, and I've been working with the concept of evil for decades. My, I believe that there is a force that should be described operationally or something, a coherent force, coherence is a big question, that consistently works, maybe we need to look into works, consistently works to make the world more broken. And then the word broken, or worse, if that more directly conveys how that coherent force is basically destructive. It is the opposite of life-serving. I claim that I can prove the existence of that. And I claim that that's part of a better human story that I've got that might have a beneficial impact if people were to see the world the way that I'm offering, because I think it holds water. But in particular, we can start with the concept of that coherent force that consistently works to make things more broken, that the Democrats should have recognized back in the early 90s and increasingly as the thing arose. And I had a ringside seat here in the Shenandoah Valley to how it went from the federal level, it went into the state level. And from both sets of politicians, gradually the Republican base that I used to do talk radio with got transformed into something you just couldn't have good conversations with anymore. Part of my issue is that I felt such a heart attachment to the conservatives of the Shenandoah Valley, or at least with that component with which I created on the radio of discourse. And I'm the kind of guy that if you can reach across the things that divide you, it makes me feel good. My wife's the same way. We watch movies, and when something really good happens between people from two different races or two different countries, it warms our hearts. That's just so that's how it was, and then it wasn't. So that's my ringside seat. I watched the well, I was on the radio when Rush Limbaugh was on the radio. I was like Tweety Bird to his Godzilla. But then Karl Rove came in and Fox News came in, not in that order. And you could see that there were changes happening, and you could speculate about how it was being accomplished. But in any event, there was a very effective multidimensional propaganda campaign coming from the forces that took over the right to shape the minds of the people whose votes they were going to need. So once you become, as I promised to offer you, if you go to my website, abetterhumanstory.org, I'll show you how that coherent force can be seen. One demonstration is that if that coherent force can be seen, then I lost my thread. I apologize. It arose and it moves through the world through the network of cause and effect, which is another idea, which I claim to be able to establish that there is a pattern of brokenness that moves through the human world. So there is a force of brokenness that's at work in our world. And if you recognize that, you don't sleep through the beginnings, this transformation of the Republican world to get to the point where you can actually, they're led by such a human monster who promises to do so much that's destructive at every level. You know, the world is going to suffer because liberal America did not kill this thing in the bud. That's the part that I think liberal America could spend at least a little time looking at. This huge transformation occurred right beneath our noses, and liberal America couldn't be awakened to the idea that there was something really different going on. Couldn't see it. Didn't see that suddenly this thing had cast itself in the form of enemy. And then for years and years, you hear only from Democrats talk about my friends across the aisle. How do you sleep through the enmity of everything the Republicans were doing to try to find a way of destroying Bill Clinton, to try to make their top priority making Obama a failure in his first term so they could take the presidency back? And then when Joe Biden takes office, all these different things in a state of brokenness from the pandemic and from Donald Trump and from what happened to the economy because of the pandemic and mismanagement of it and the people dying and all the trauma that we had been through, all those things which could have been an opportunity to move things forward. This same destructive political party shows no interest in doing anything cooperatively. Cooperation is a Republican who cooperates is going to be shot down by his own party. It's a betrayal of the party to do bipartisan things. I believe that a big part of their kicking out the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, was that he would get the necessary business of the country done, relying on mostly Democratic votes. That's a pretty good sign of how broken the spirit is on the other side. When I say a coherent force, I don't only mean like one actor who is this consistently makes things worse, like the Republican Party has come to do, which wasn't true about the party of Eisenhower, or, all the way through the first Bush, but it became true. It was really hard to find anything constructive that the W administration did, let alone Trump. There is a drama which I claim that I can show inevitably arose would necessarily arise for any creature that takes the unprecedented step of getting itself out of the niche in which it evolved biologically, like living like primates in our case, stepping onto the path of civilization. I claim that a huge, inevitable impetus of brokenness entered into the human world. And then I claim that I can show how it moves through. So the idea that there is something to keep your eye open for working in the world, a coherent force, not necessarily only coherent in terms of a single actor, which is how I discovered it as the Republican Party became this thing, because the Democratic Party was so clueless about what was taking over there and about the implications of that, and about how if they wanted to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, as we now see, it needed to do battle against it as soon as it became visible, but it didn't become visible, and I can testify to that because I spent from 2005 I launched my first website, a better nonesoblind.org, which is on my current website too. It's archived by the archivy people, and it was a depiction of something that had gone seriously wrong, that was pointing in this direction, and that was what I felt needed to be done. Incidentally, my attempt after W won re-election at the end of 2004 was to enlist a man I thought was the best voice available to us to raise the moral and spiritual alarm that the rising force of fascism represented. And this is well, let's say 2004 turning into 2005, I had an exchange with Bill Moyers, who I think is a wonderful example of America, uh, an American at its best. I just think he's been a splendid force in American history. I don't know much about how he was as press secretary to LBJ, but he's been a great voice for sort of a deep spiritual take on things. And that's what I thought America should have. Um, so that when he and I had an exchange back and forth, and I asked him, would he be willing to take up that mantle? And I would do anything I could to serve him, playing the role of warning the country to rally to basic American values against a force of fascism that was becoming visible in the presidency of George W. Bush. I knew that he had the similar perception of what was going on. It is depressing to me how much people forget how dark and dangerous and destructive W was as president, with Dick Cheney pushing him in certain directions and Karl Rove pushing him in other directions. He is nonetheless the guy who chose those two guys. It was a presidency that deliberately sacrificed national unity for its own political gain in the wake of 9/11. Whole story. Something uniquely dark and moving in directions that actually responsibly could be called, this is the flavor and structure of fascism. And I'm a guy who's resisted using fascist when a lot of people on the left have thrown that word around. No, but this time it really became true, um, to an alarming degree, though it looks like small potatoes now with Trump. It was visible. liberal America did not see it. It did not, therefore, fight it, and it allowed it to get more powerful. That should have been, the actors did things that should have been made them pay a political price. But again and again, because the liberals were not seeing what their friends across the aisle were up to, didn't make them pay any price. In fact, there are certain junctures, beginning of Obama's administration, for example, where the liberal the world, with Obama leading, dealt with the Republicans in a way that strengthened those who had made a determination that there would be no cooperation. He strengthened the more destructive, and those on the more moderate side of the Republican Party, like Charles Grassley, was ready to work with the Obama administration, but he saw which way the wind was blowing, and it wasn't blowing anywhere from Obama because he never engaged with the destructiveness for what it was. Why was liberal America so consistently unable to see it, unable, therefore, to fight it? I think it's largely because liberal America is basically an America of the secular worldview. It sees things in terms of the evidence and conclusions we can draw from the evidence. A lot of it's science, and we get to an America in which what's true is not widely believed. The lie is getting sold, and liberal America is not really looking at how do we keep these lies from ruling unopposed in the psyches of all these people in conservative America. I was told Limbaugh's audience is not our concern. If you're looking at the forces at work in the human world, you can see that there's something happening here in which a force of brokenness is advancing itself. Rush Limbaugh and Newt Gingrich, Fox News, Karl Rove, they're moving people's consciousness in a direction that serves the rise of fascism in a whole variety of ways. And it happened right in front of our eyes. And it went unopposed. And I think it's because in the liberal worldview, which I'll just call the secular worldview, there is no such thing as evil, even if you define it the way I do as a coherent force that consistently works to make things more broken, and words that can be defined to say. And then you can show that there are coherent forces of that kind. I think, largely, the world gets more complicated, but it's a big piece of the truth is that there are two coherent forces at work in the human world. And that was inevitable as soon as we stepped out of the niche in which we evolved biologically, because the inevitable unleashing of a destructive force. If you're aware of that, then you can see what was happening in America. Because a pattern of brokenness that inevitably arose with the civilization creating creature because of the disorder that this new situation created. That brokenness translated into the into the brokenness of other forms as causes have effects and the effects become causes of other things, and a pattern of brokenness which constitutes what makes this a coherent force. And I've got the phrase, we can see this force, a force of brokenness, a force of destruction, a force of evil, the way we can see the wind and the swaying of the trees and the flapping of the clothes on the line. If you understood that this was how the world worked, you wouldn't have slept through what was the Republican Party was becoming, and stood aside as it got more and more powerful and exerted more and more destructive impact on the minds of tens of millions of Americans, till we get to this point, which wouldn't have been possible if the fight had been fought early and hard. We get to the point where the more Americans vote for everything dark than for the light that Kamala Harris did a splendid job of showing. She was like a beacon in contrast with Trump's darkness. And we've reached the point where half of America could have all this darkness displayed right before their eyes. And whether they see it or don't see it, they vote for it. That wouldn't have happened if it wasn't that we are a cultural system in which the two sides are actually, in a sense, dynamically connected with each other, almost like two particles in quantum mechanics. So they become, in a sense, negatives of one another to the extent to which they get divided. So this one is going to be dark in this way and light in that way. This one will be dark in this way and the opposites. The Republican Party becomes great at the pursuit of power, but they're morally bankrupt. The Democratic Party is aligned with all the basic good values, plus a few pieces of craziness thrown in. But they are completely oblivious of what's required to prevent those values from getting trampled by the force that's taken over the right. That contrast, one that makes a fight over everything and one that seems incapable of making a decent fight over anything. That's how I put it when I ran for Congress in 2011, 2012, against a typical Republican. But I was over-optimistic about how much in 2012, say, conservatives might come to understand how the Republican Party related to the values that I had heard from them that they held dear. Christian values, patriotic values, values of good character. They were eloquent back in the 90s about how sacred all those things were. But already I think I can say that already by 2012, they were locked into something that could do anything without alienating them. And it became less and less hidden. So the people on the conservative side looked at this force of brokenness and had been manipulated into a state in which they could embrace that force of brokenness as if it represented the opposite of what it was. And meanwhile, on the liberal side, there's some kind of an unmooring that's taken place because they do not have the capacity to conceive of something that could reasonably be called a force of evil. Oh, evil, that's an old-fashioned thing. That's what the religious worldview had. And I put forward into the liberal world in 2005, the word evil, the concept of evil. And, and I know that liberals have a strong commitment to the idea that there's nothing worth talking about in the world that's real that you could reasonably call evil. Now, I don't insist it be called evil, but it acts like evil has traditionally been understood. And there is a coherent force. And in order to see that coherent force, you got to have some kind of space in your mind for there to be such a coherent force. And for one thing, the worldview of liberal America is very fragmented. You see things in pieces. I mean, I'm talking about, for example, I spent a lot of time talking about all the different ways in which the Republican Party was making things more broken. Not issue by issue, but a list of 10 different dynamics at work on different issues. And in every case, the Republican Party was making things worse. And it was important to put the pieces together because the Democrats were still thinking this was politics as usual. Now, politics as usual wasn't having a particular side continually working to make things worse. That was unusual. And it was testimony to something had happened and it needed to be responded to. And the Democrats basically needed to be talking to the American people in whatever way would most move them to reject this assault on basic American values, both constitutional values and Judeo-Christian values, which is what it manifestly was. But the liberals are still not very good at fighting the fight. The fight is basically between good and evil. Don't need to use those words. You can just show it. The same Republican Party that's taking this position on climate change is also behind the possible policy of abandoning Ukraine to the aggressor. And you can go on with the list. The picture of something very dark can be sold. It should have been seen, this coherent force, when it became manifest as it emerged in the 1990s and gathered ever greater power, and as the years went along, finally culminating in this election. Well, don't know if it's too late, but I think that it would be useful as part of the campaign to become capable of fighting the fight that needs to be fought, is to have a better understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about good and evil, and how how well that aligns with democracy versus fascism, and how much that aligns with life-serving versus life-destroying, or life at least degrading. How you can create a vivid picture of our world in which the true nature of this power that's taken, that's strong enough now that they've basically got the government for at least the next 2 years. And who knows what the scenarios are going to be. But now's the time to go fighting against this force of fascism by waging a campaign of messaging and actions, but I'm thinking now of messaging that's maximally designed to have the maximal impact on getting the American people behind the values that Trump's election is endangering, including our democracy, including not rewarding the aggressor, the war maker, instead of the peaceful order. A whole list of things. Fight the fight by looking at what Trump does and what the Trump party does, and denounce it in the best possible terms for helping people see how this is serving as a force of destruction in this way, in that way, in that way, and calling upon Americans to defend our best values. Like the Department of Justice should not be, you should not nominate somebody like Matt Gaetz to head the Department of Justice. That's not defending the American Constitution to put such a person in charge of such a system. That all fits into destruction versus wholeness, the rule of law versus lawlessness. This is a fight that can be won if it can be waged persuasively and dramatically enough. And part of that needs to be coming to understand the it that we're fighting, the evil that we're fighting, the coherent force that is this Trump power that we can be pretty sure will consistently work to make things more broken. It would be a surprise to have anything constructive come out of it. I can't think of anything constructive that came out of the first Trump presidency, and a whole long list of destructive things. Anyway, the extent to which he is consistently making things more broken, he and his party can be shown to the American people as evil, a coherent force that we need to oppose because of the good that we love. Thank you. Please go to my website, abetterhumanstory.org, where I claim that I can tie all these things together in a fairly compelling and logical way, which is consistent with the evidence that we have about the story of humankind and about how things work in the human world. I've been working my whole adult life, actually since I've been in my mid-teens, to develop an understanding. And the world gave me as much opportunity as I can imagine being given to developing the skills to develop this sort of thing. And I feel that I've come up with something that actually, if we understood it, would help us fight this destructive force. Because it's a question mark whether the human civilization is going to continue on this planet for the long haul. We have shown ourselves to have such destructive forces working that are destroying ourselves because of them is a real possibility. I call it a toss-up about the next not so many generations, whether we'll get our act together or blow it. I don't really know the probabilities, but that's my gut feeling, that we got a chance. But there's a significant chance that we're going to blow it. And I actually think that if we understood the dynamic that I've been laying out in its various dimensions about what it means to be a civilization creating creature. And one of the things it means is any creature on any planet that extricates itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically is going to get swept up into a process, independently of its own inborn nature, in which the civilization is going to develop in ways that are not a function of human nature, of that creature's nature, but are a function of a systemic dynamic that emerges inevitably because of the new situation that the breakthrough into civilization inevitably entails. It's a disordered civilization, and that has huge ramifications. Anyway, I claim that if we understood that, then we could place doing now in a big picture context, which goes back to the beginnings of civilization and goes out to the global level where democracy and fascism are embattled, and gives us a perspective on this terrible defeat that the forces of democracy has just suffered, the terrible feat that the force of good has just suffered. And the world of cause and effect is such that that when evil wins, when the force of brokenness wins, the consequences will reinforce the forces of brokenness. And we've got to contend with what this defeat will mean in terms of what they can do with their power, what they will try to do with their power. But it also depends on fighting for the hearts and minds of the American people to bring them onto the side of goodness. I don't believe that a majority of the American people actually find evil appealing. It's a part of America. But I think that the fight has to be fought in terms of good versus evil. And the question isn't that. The question is how to conduct that fight in what terms in order to draw the support of all the good people who voted for Trump, whatever their defects were, to overpower those defects and bring them back to the side of good. That's an important thing. And I encourage you to take a look at this perspective I'm offering that I'm calling a better human story. If that had been in the minds of liberal America over the last 30 years, the age of Newt Gingrich would never have led to the age of W, would never have led to the age of Trump. It could have been defeated early on. So that's one example of how, according to what I'm asserting, if this better human story had been present then, we wouldn't have gotten to this catastrophe. And if we're going to fight the fight now, it's best that we understand exactly what we're up against. And in the light of what it is that force is and how it operates, then to better create a strategy for fighting it politically, in terms of messaging, the whole thing. If you don't know what the battlefield is, your battle plans aren't necessarily going to be the best. Okay, thank you very much. A better human